We already decided that strikes are a bad thing. We know that most labor disputes are settled without anybody going on strike. Strikes have become increasingly rare, in fact, over time. But can anybody tell me where the term strike comes from? Sailors, when facing horrendous conditions on ships, would lower or strike the sails. And that is, in fact, where the term strike comes from. These labor actions date back to the 1600s, when sailors faced some pretty dismal conditions on those ships. Oftentimes their wages were withheld, they were fed rotten food, all these kinds of things. So just so you know, a little factoid, that's where the term strike comes from. I want to talk for a second about early American labor organizing and education systems. So I'm sure you all have heard of the system of masters, journeymen, and apprentices. This was both the education organization and the labor organization system for skilled craft labor, going back as far as the 12th century in England. What this meant, of course, is that when you were an apprentice, you were essentially bonded to the master. You were housed, sometimes you were fed, you were taught your craft, but you were not a free person. When you finished your apprenticeship, you were able to then become a journeyman, which meant that you could travel and do your work. And eventually, if you had enough status and money, you could become a master. Unionization, of course, changed the nature of apprenticeship, I would say for the better, because apprentices now actually get paid while they're learning their craft. But it's an important thing to think about in terms of how labor organizations controlled the flow of skilled labor, because they determined how many apprentices there would be, and that, of course, would determine how many journeymen there could be. That would mean there was a small pool of masons or carpenters or coopers, right? All of these are skilled trades, which meant that they could set prices. So they could set prices for their wages, they could set prices for their goods, because there was nobody else around who could do the work. This craft orientation towards labor was what existed for centuries prior to the Industrial Revolution. What did we get with the Industrial Revolution? We got the rise of factories, plantations, cities, railroads, steamboats, all kinds of mechanisms of mass production. This challenged the craft labor system because suddenly you didn't have a single craftsperson making a pair of shoes. You had a factory cranking out huge numbers of pairs of shoes. And of course, this gave rise also to a new working class. You can see in the one picture, you have sharecroppers picking cotton on a plantation. Down here, you have probably Chinese immigrants building the railroad. Here you have women working in a mill, a textile mill. So this new working class was also largely made up of former slave labor, of new immigrant labor, and for the first time often, young women coming out of the home and working for wages. So there was a way in which the new wage system of the Industrial Revolution actually gave a kind of freedom that many of these kinds of workers had not had before. But as you all well know, from the transition from slavery to sharecropping, that did not necessarily actually mean freedom. So there was ways in which these new labor systems reproduced some of the same exploitations that had preceded them. But it did create new opportunities. The other thing it created was a brand new 1%. This was the Gilded Age. These were the robber barons of that Gilded Age. Let's look and see who we've got up here. John Rockefeller, Standard Oil Company. If you look at this picture more carefully, so you've got the oil barrels stretching all the way back to the Capitol, oil stacks coming up behind, and what he's got in his hand there is the Supreme Court. He's stuffing money into it. Does this sound familiar? We've got Andrew Carnegie over here, who built Carnegie Steel. He was one of the richest men in the history of this country. But he also generated a philanthropy movement where he said that the wealthy actually had a social responsibility to take their wealth and use it for the good of society. So in the last years of his life, he actually gave away 90% of his fortune. So there was this kind of social philanthropy associated with that massive wealth, in contrast to Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was one of the railroad barons of this age. And his quote is, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?" So this kind of evolution of a new ruling class, as well as a new working class, created the new dynamic under which workers in the United States began to organize unions as we know them now. And those unions sort of fell into two categories at the beginning. The American Federation of Labor, which was founded in 1886, promoted craft unionism. So it still came from the idea of the guilds, still came from the idea of the apprentices and the masters and the journeymen. Well, when mass production began to really grow in this country, there was a committee that was formed within the AFL. It was called the Committee on Industrial Organizations. And it was made up of some of the unions that were most interested in organizing the mass production workforce. Those were the mine workers unions, the International Ladies Garment Workers unions. These were the unions that were paying attention to the new kinds of labor and the new kinds of economic system. And there was a great deal of conflict between the AFL and the CIO. And in fact, the AFL kicked out those unions that had formed the committee in 1938, and they then became the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And the AFL and the CIO remained separate until 1955. But you can see that the big issue in these early days of union organizing was the 8-hour day. This was the big fight. Most work days prior to this were 12 hours, maybe longer. People would work easily 6 days a week, sometimes 6.5. So these were hugely exploitative working conditions for poverty wages. So the idea of fighting for the 8-hour day was core, and you can see that on May 1st, 1886, 350,000 workers in the US went on strike for the 8-hour day. By the end of that year, there had been 1,400 strikes. 610,000 workers went out on strike. More than 11,000 businesses experienced strikes, including some of the largest corporations at the time. There were other organizations that were associated with the AFL. One in particular I want to point out to you, which is the National Women's Trade Union League. It was formed sort of as a sister organization to the AFL in 1903. And it was primarily formed, well, it's formed, I would say, for two primary reasons. One is most unions didn't allow women in. So one of the things that the Women's League did was help women to organize unions. They were also deeply concerned about child labor. So a lot of the kind of what we would think of as early social work kind of grew out of this labor-oriented movement against child labor. And a lot of the upper class women who supported working families, this is how they did it. Okay? One of the things that you need to know about the strikes at this time, lots of them happened in the textile industry. How many of you have ever heard of the Bread and Roses strike? 1912, Lawrence, Massachusetts. This was a massive strike, and one of the key things to know about it is that there were so many different languages spoken amongst the workforce. Their strike committee had to translate into more than a dozen languages. Can you imagine that today? We have enough trouble just getting our unions to translate stuff into Spanish. So in 1912, the Bread and Roses strike was groundbreaking, not only as labor organizing, but also in terms of how it embraced immigrant organizing. You can think about it in your own terms. Bread, the basic stuff of life, sustenance, right? Roses, the beauty, the things that we all deserve above and beyond basic sustenance. Bread and Roses became a theme of these early strikes. So the AFL-CIO was formed in 1955 when these two organizations came back together. And it was at the height of union density in the United States. Can anybody tell me what that percentage was? When we were at our highest, what percentage of workers in the United States were in unions? About 35. Almost entirely private sector. Because remember, at this time, there really weren't public sector unions. So this is how these two unions came back together. I'll talk a little bit more later about the political conditions under which they reformed. But not all of the unions welcomed all workers. And in particular, a lot of immigrants were excluded. And even more specifically, Asian immigrants. This was particularly virulent here in the West. There were huge riots in a lot of the cities along the West Coast to kick out Chinese immigrants. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was just the legal expression of that. You can see in this picture here, this is from the Working Man's Party of California. And they're celebrating the fact that the Chinese are being kicked out. They saw them as competition. They saw them as cheap labor that was going to undermine their jobs. But it was also just straight up racism. This is saying these are not our people. And we as Working Man's Party, as political parties, as unions, need to protect the power that we garner through organization for white workers, and even more specifically for white male workers. Now, not all of the labor organizations in the early days were like this. There was, of course, the Industrial Workers of the World, also known as the IWW or the Wobblies, formed in 1905. Their slogan was, "One big union." They didn't exclude anybody, not even the unemployed. They were largely led by anarchists, socialists, and communists. Lots of European immigrants who brought with them those philosophies from the experiences that they had in Europe leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. They wanted to get rid of the wage system altogether. Their philosophy was, in fact, workers should own the means of production. Now, the AFL and the CIO got in plenty of beefs between them. And when I'm talking about beefs, I'm talking about fisticuffs. I mean, folks from these different labor organizations would literally fight each other at labor actions. Well, everybody hated the Wobblies. And they got a huge amount of pushback. One of the things that they engaged in as a way to promote democracy and labor organizing was free speech fights. There was one here in Portland in the early teens. Big one in Spokane, Washington in 1909. So they would bring workers together in the streets. They would stand up literally on soapboxes, and they would tell their stories about exploitation in the workplace. And these gatherings would grow, and eventually the cops would bust them. And so the Wobblies had this strategy of going out on the streets, doing this free speech, and packing the jails. Okay? And it was quite successful because oftentimes these jails were tiny, and they did not have enough resources to feed large groups of prisoners for a long time. So, free speech, get rid of the wage system, everybody's welcome, one big union. This was radical unionism. So you had craft, you had industrial. This was also industrial unionism. But it was industrial without the divisions between mine workers and garment workers, et cetera, et cetera. There were some very important leaders, women leaders, that came out of these movements, despite the fact that women, for the most part, were not allowed to either be union members or let alone be union staff. And I want to introduce you to a couple of them, less well known. Rose Schneiderman and Rose Posada, both Jewish immigrants. And it was Rose Schneiderman that said, what the woman who labors wants is the right to live, not simply exist. The right to life as the rich woman has the right to life, and the sun and the music and art. You have nothing that the humblest worker has not the right to have also. The worker must have bread, but she must have roses too. Rose Posada was an anarchist, a feminist, labor organizer with the ILGWU, actually was sent out to Los Angeles. A lot of people don't know this part of the history, to organize almost exclusively Mexican immigrant women in the garment industry in Los Angeles, a workforce that to this day is still largely unorganized. So there were some very important women leaders. They came out of the Jewish tradition, which really valued education, valued critical thinking. Now, usually that was limited to boys, but they're coming out of that tradition, what gave them the basis from which to become critical thinkers, from which to become educated, and ultimately from which to become leaders. There was also this woman, Anna Louise Strong. Anybody ever heard of Anna Louise Strong? She was also part of the strike committee for the February 1919 Seattle General Strike. And she was the first female elected member of the Seattle School Board. She was deeply concerned about the state of child welfare and child education. And when her colleagues realized her political bent, they recalled her off the school board. And they were able to do that. And she continued to fight with them and went back and said, okay, fine, you've recalled me, but you have to replace me with another woman. This was her priority, and so they did. They replaced her with a woman named Evangeline Harper, who came from the big local country club. That was how they replaced Anna Louise Strong. So, she was a columnist for the Seattle Union Record. She was a member of the strike committee, very deeply involved in both labor organizing and the development of leadership. In the 1930s, we get to the huge upsurge of labor organizing in this country. Remember that the AFL and the CIO were still separate at this point. But both of them, both the craft unions and the industrial unions, grew massively. So in the late 1930s, the percentage of unionized workers went from 14% to 28%, doubled between 1936 and 1938 in 2 years. The auto workers saw its membership go from 20,000 to 400,000 in 12 months. So those numbers give you some idea of the intensity of the organizing that was going on here. Now let me ask you, at this point in time, was there such a thing as legal collective bargaining? There was not. So all of the organizing that I have been talking about so far, all of the unions, existed outside of the legal structure that we now think of as fundamental to unionism. And all of these workers, whether it was in 1938, we have the First National Convention of the Women's Economic Council Auxiliary to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was led by a labor organizer named A. Philip Randolph. This was a union of almost exclusively African American men, because that's who the car porters were, right? Sleeping car porters were. 36, 37, United Auto Workers did the sit-down strike against General Motors in Flint, Michigan. Won their first big contract that set patterns for the auto industry to this day. 1934, there was a West Coast, all up and down the West Coast, Longshore went on strike. In Minneapolis, the Teamster strike grew into a general strike. So the level of labor activism during this period was huge. And there was also a political fight going on. So while workers were struggling in the streets and in the factories, in Washington, finally, union rights and labor standards become federal law. 3 incredibly important laws. The Davis-Bacon Act, which created prevailing wage for federal public works projects, and most states have similar laws. How many of you ever heard of project labor agreements? Anybody ever heard of this? So these are agreements that get signed about what the labor standards for any public works project are going to be. So if there's tax money going into it, it has to reach certain standards. And prevailing wage is one of them, which is why you are going to see, it's happening already, prevailing wage under attack. In fact, it was when, after Hurricane Katrina, President Bush suspended the Davis-Bacon Act in New Orleans by federal law. Now, he got huge pushback on that from the craft unions, and he did reinstate it. But you can see, why is this a powerful law? Creating fundamental labor standards for any publicly funded works project, whether it's done by union labor or not. Powerful law. The Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, finally establishes rules for collective bargaining. Prior to this, there was no mandate for employers to actually come to the table and bargain. The Wagner Act finally did that. It covered most private sector workers in the U.S. 2 very important groups of workers in the private sector who were left out. Can anybody tell me who that was? Not covered under the Wagner Act. Still true to this day. Agricultural workers and domestic workers. Now, why do you suppose that those 2 groups were left out? Who were the agricultural workers of the time? African Americans. They were African Americans for the most part in the South. This was still an ongoing legacy of slavery. There was a deal cut, literally a deal cut, that said, we'll vote for this law if you don't have it be enforced on our agricultural workforce. Domestic workers. Who were they? Immigrants, African Americans, and women. Almost exclusively the domestic worker force were women. So even when we won, even with the big victory, there was still this dividing up of the working class and saying that some had the rights to collective bargaining and some did not. Some kind of work would be valued under the law and some kind of work would not, right? So this pattern, this theme, is ongoing throughout the history of our labor movement. Who's in, who's out? Who's got it, who doesn't? And then in 1938, finally, we got the 8-hour day through the Fair Labor Standards Act. It put a floor on wages and a ceiling on hours, provided for overtime pay, and also outlawed child labor, put standards on child labor. So this was the big victory, this period of time. But remember, didn't cover folks like you, because you work in the public sector. Now, after this, big business decided to fight back. They were not happy with the fact that collective bargaining was now a legal mandate. So in 1947, they passed what was called the Taft-Hartley Act. You can see down here, labor called it the Slave Labor Bill. They were vehemently opposed to the Taft-Hartley Act. What did Taft-Hartley do? It puts many restrictions on how workers could organize, where you could strike, whether or not you could call boycotts, right? Lots of restrictions on how workers could organize. Also passed right to work. Right to work did not exist at a federal level until 1947 when the Taft-Hartley Act was passed. But it did not make the country right to work. It gave individual states the right to pass these laws. That's why the right to work fights today are state by state, because Taft-Hartley made it a state's right to impose right to work laws. Do you remember earlier on when Sherman was doing the Union Values presentation, there was a picture of Martin Luther King. And the quote on there was about right to work. It was about the right to work laws. King and other civil rights leaders understood that labor rights and civil rights were intimately connected, could not be separated, and that when the government and the anti-union politicians were pushing things like right to work laws, they were going after civil rights as well as labor rights. And he understood that connection. The Landrum-Griffin Act of 1959, also called the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act, one of the favorite laws of all times for unions. This is where unions have to report everything. What they spend their money on, how they run their elections, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you can actually see this as a positive thing for rank and file members because it imposed laws around democratic union procedure. But it also bureaucratized unions to a tremendous extent. So, and the reason why the Landrum-Griffin Act was passed, I should say, is because a number of the very large unions, Teamsters amongst them, were under investigation for corruption. This is when unions were getting mobbed up, right? So this was the federal government's response to corruption within the union movement as well. So whether or not you think that this kind of regulation of unions was a good thing or a bad thing, it nevertheless made running unions a lot more difficult, a lot more complicated, a lot more bureaucratic. So there is an upside and a downside to both of these things. On the one hand, you have your right to collective bargaining under law. This is huge. On the other hand, you now have organizations that are run by these laws, run by these regulations and policies, that fundamentally changes, I would argue, the nature, the basic nature of unionism. This is when we're talking about union values. Remember the very first slide said, what is a union? A union is a group of workers standing together. That's it. There was no laws that actually gave them rights prior to the passage of the Wagner Act. So as you see these more and more laws and more regulations being piled on, it begins to reshape the nature of what unionism is. And the kind of unionism that we are struggling with today is very much reflective of these kinds of changes, okay, for good or bad. The formation of unions dropped massively after these laws were passed. Okay? Unions have, let's see, I have some statistics for you here. During the 12-year administration of the Wagner Act, so this was the time between 1935 and 1947, unions won over 80% of union elections. In the first year after the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, unions won only about 70%, and that percentage continued to drop.